My name is Jeremy Apgar. I've been the cartographer here at the Trail Conference for nearly 13 years, producing published trail maps, maps for trail building efforts, maps for land conservation efforts, and many other kinds of maps for the Trail Conference. And my general desire in crafting a trail map is to produce a map that's simplistic in design, yet detailed, accurate, and attractive for use by as broad a group of users as possible. So today we're going to have some fun talking about maps, starting with a bit of trail map history. And then from there, we'll go through the map making process sort of from start to finish. And through the way, I'll be highlighting some of the ways that volunteers play crucial roles in our map development. As mentioned in the first slides, we'll save a question and answer session for the end using the chat functions. So to start off with, who is the Trail Conference? Many of you may already be familiar with our organization, but if not, we're a volunteer-powered organization that builds, maintains, and protects public trails. Together with our partners, we strive to ensure that the trails and natural areas we share are sustainable and accessible for all to enjoy for generations to come. And for decades, trail users have relied on our trail maps to help them navigate on and off the trails. And so here's an example of one of our typical trail maps. This is our Harriman Bear Mountain Trails map focused on the Bear Mountain area. And just as a general overview, the maps are basically 5 colors. They're printed with 6 specific inks with solid red trail lines, blaze color symbols, green parklands, the brown contours, and black roads and text. The maps include trail mileage numbers, as well as points of interest like parking areas, viewpoints, other named features, and lean-tos. We use a simple topographic background that uses mostly 20-foot contour lines, sometimes 10-foot or 50-foot contours as well. And the maps are printed on a thick Tyvek that's waterproof and tear-resistant. And we produce our individual maps so that they're not too large as to be unwieldy out on the trails. And their folded sizes makes them nice and compact for storage. So this is what a map looks, what our maps look like today. But we've been doing this for quite a while. So before we head into some trail map history, I'm posting a quick poll just to see how long you think we've been making maps. So this will come up in just a moment. All right, so if you could take a moment to answer this, how long has the Trail Conference been making trail maps? Once most everyone's submitted their answers, I'll share with you all before we continue. And we'll go from there. All righty, give a couple more seconds here. And there we go. All right. So let's share that with everyone. So most of you said 100 years since 1920, and then pretty even split between 60 years to 86 years. A few said 48 years. No one said 25 years. So definitely think longer than a couple decades. So all right, great. We'll I'll close that out. So this was actually sort of a trick question. Since both 48 years since 1972 and 86 years since 1934, we're technically correct. So congratulations to those of you who guessed that. To sort of explain that dual answer, our first unofficial maps were started in the 1930s with Bill Hefferlin's hand-drawn black and white maps. And then it wasn't until the early 1970s that the first official Trail Conference branded maps were produced. So our map style has been developed over nearly 50 years, and we've largely learned what does and does not work on trail maps, especially in terms of ease of use and readability by users. So even before Bill Heffernan came along with his maps, there were some early maps like this map from 1917. Some outing clubs produced their own maps to show the trail networks they typically used. This was one from the Wyanoke Plateau that was created for the Green Mountain Club, and again, 1917. And if we zoom in on this, we can see some dotted footpaths with some have the trail names. And if you're familiar with Northern Green State Forest in New Jersey, some of these names may look familiar, such as Caras Hill, Otter Hole, Blue Mine, and Roomy Mine. Although I'm pretty sure there isn't a Seven Husbands trail these days, so certain things have changed, certain things have not. But yeah, this was one of our early map examples from now over 100 years ago. But the primary go-to maps for most were USGS topographic quads, while the other maps were often for either a single park or a small area. These maps provided complete coverage for the region at a 1 mile to 1 inch scale. And they were also easily available at map stores and other locations. The detailed topography sometimes included old woods roads, but there were plenty of paths not shown, so many users would draw on the routes they knew. And for use in the field, hikers would often mount the topo maps on canvas or other material. So this is an example of a map from the Catskills, an earlier USGS map that was dated around 1924 that they had put on some canvas material and drew in some of the different trails and access routes and streams and different things. So for many maps throughout the 1900s, the USGS maps often provided the base map layers upon which the maps were produced. In 1923, the first edition of the New York Walkbook was produced by the American Geographical Society, and this was the first comprehensive guide to trails throughout the region. It included regional maps that used the USGS maps as a base, such as this map covering Schoonamunk, Black Rock Forest, Storm King, Breakneck Ridge, and some parts of Bear Mountain and Hudson Highlands. Here's a close-up of that map. As much as possible, the map included trails and points of interest. Here, again, they're dotted lines up along Breakneck Ridge and Black Rock Forest and areas like that. So the scale of these maps, it did make it a bit difficult to really incorporate too much detail, but combined with the information in the guidebook, they were instrumental in helping early hikers, or trampers as they were called at the time, discover the trails in the area. All right, so by the mid-1930s, there had been no real comprehensive mapping of trails in the region, aside from individual parks here and there. A fellow by the name of William Heffernan came along and changed all that, and for over 4 decades, he was the primary map maker for the hiking community. He was a modern Renaissance man, and he would go on to produce nearly 70 detailed hikers' regions maps of trails and woods roads, most of which he personally explored, covering all hiking areas from New York City to the Catskills. And here are just a couple early pictures. Here he is leading a group of his hiking club on one of the trails, and elsewhere posing with a group here in this coat and hat here. So yeah, he was really instrumental in getting some of these first maps out there. So here's an example of one of these hikers region maps. These maps were mostly 11-inch by 17-inch maps, black and white topographic maps, and originally they sold for 10 to 25 cents. They were remarkably detailed, although not always strictly accurate. However, there are many cases where comparisons with more recent maps have shown the trail routes to be fairly correct. So it's been pretty neat to see how accurate they are, considering the time when they were made and how they were made. So here's a close-up of that map on Bear Mountain, and we can see here he used these plus sign dashes to sort of highlight marked trails. Here's the tip-torn Appalachian Trail coming up Bear Mountain, the Suffern Bear Mountain Trail going along with these blazes. And he also included the blaze color in a circle here. We've got a B for blue and W for white and so on. And so these maps were pretty much what was available, and with the topographic trail information, the hydrologic information, the road information, all in black ink. It definitely took a bit of practice to be able to use these maps and pull out that different information. But once you got used to it enough, it wasn't too bad to use. So to actually do the mapping out in the trails, Bill carried his pencil, paper, and compass in his knapsack everywhere he went, and he had quite an eye for mapping out the trails. From studying his maps, he certainly had an outstanding ability to understand the topography and translate that to the paper very well. This is just a picture from a newspaper clipping where he was out using his compass and sights to map out some different areas. And this is also an example of a sketch map he made of the Pine Meadow Trail in Harriman State Park, showing some of his careful notes about trail conditions and important reference points that he would use to put onto the map itself. Here's Bill making maps in his house. Maps were largely based on the USGS topographic quads, along with other supplemental maps. And he tried to reissue revised lithographic prints about every 2 years. Sometimes he'd produce these blueprint versions that were distributed, and he sent notes out to people to send in corrections and things directly to him so that he could check them out and get maps updated. In some cases, he actually went out and marked his own actual trails just so that every map could contain at least one marked trail. He'd connect trails and woods roads into a pleasant route with the intention of sort of forming a 10-mile walk between transportation access points. And he'd clear them, repaint them yearly, and it's estimated he regularly maintained about 80 miles of his favorite trails single-handedly. So when he wasn't making maps, he was out clearing trails or also doing early newsletters before our trail walker came on board. So with the Hikers Regions maps, users of the maps would also sometimes add in their own modifications to improve readability. Here's an example where someone had used colored pencils to draw in some of the different blue and red and yellow trail routes. Here using green for the white blazes of the Appalachian Trail. So by 1970, with the exception of a few parks, Bill's maps continued to be the most reliable, up-to-date, and inexpensive trail maps in the region. So they were crucial for many people to get out and explore these areas. So Bill passed away in 1970, and this left an immediate void for trail maps. And with the unreliability of their availability for a few years while the owners of the maps changed hands a couple times, the Trail Conference took it upon itself to begin providing trail maps. So the first official trail conference maps were produced in 1972, this Eastern Catskills map on the left side, and 1974, our Winoki area map. I'll just zoom in on this Winoki area map here. So these maps shared a similar style. They featured two colors, brown contours and black everything else. And both these new maps were printed on a waterproof synthetic paper. And in 1973, our Trail Walker newsletter actually included a survey asking people which areas they'd like to see mapped next. And Harriman Park and Catskills were the sort of overwhelming top picks. Luckily, our publications committee had already started work on a map of Harriman, as that was certainly one of the most popular areas that needed some comprehensive mapping done. So our next style of maps were 1975 and 1977, and these were our Harriman Bear Mountain 2-map set and East Hudson 3-map set. So here's just zooming in on our Harriman map in 1975. These maps had several improvements, including the use of 4 colors now, with red dashed lines for trails, blue for water features, and then gray topography and black for the roads and labels and things. But the another key thing that we did was the Harriman maps were produced as a set of north and south maps to replace the previous very large map that was produced by the park. Sorry, it was often referred to as the bed sheet for how large it was. It was just humongous, and having these north and south individual smaller size maps greatly improved the usability out on the trail. And these maps also used the reverse sides to include an index of all the trails, mountains, lakes, and shelters throughout the park. So this 1975 Harriman map was fairly costly and required a huge effort by many, but the map sold extremely well and sort of paved the way for the 1977 East Hudson maps, as well as successive revisions of the Harriman map in 1977 and 1980. And also at this time, the publication, the map committee, made a pretty tough decision regarding the costly Tyvek that we used to print these on. So rather than using less expensive materials, they stuck with the Tyvek and decided to increase the map prices instead. So we've continued to use Tyvek ever since. We're now 40 plus years later, and we certainly have no plans to stop, as that's one of the unique things that makes our maps rugged and hold up well for repeated use. So moving on a little bit to 1985, our Catskill 5-map set was the first 5-color map that we produced, and this continued us on the trajectory toward our current map standards by having a simplistic trail-focused map style of solid red trail lines, brown contours, and using a thicker Tyvek stock than our initial maps. Here's a blow-up of that map focused on Hunter Mountain in the Catskills. We introduced green shading to show parklands, and this was a huge improvement to some of the previous methods for showing these boundaries. And again, this style of map is what set the stage for our map standards for colors and line styles even today. If you compare this map with the maps today, there are many things that are very similar. So moving into the 90s, here's our 1993 East Hudson map set. And this was technically a 4th edition revision, but it was actually a brand new map done by a professional cartographer, Ted Cook. And it looked entirely different from the previous 3rd edition. Here's a zoom in of that at Breakneck Ridge. These had more of our standard map style elements and a switch to 20-foot contour lines from, I believe, 100 on this one before, which really came in handy for traversing this sort of terrain and seeing where the steeper areas were that you couldn't really get from the 100-foot contours. So in the mid-90s, the techniques associated with mapping in the trails in the field changed pretty greatly as GPS technology allowed for more accurate trail plotting. So starting in 1992, one of our volunteers, Daniel Chazen, started GPSing trails in Harriman for an upcoming map revision. At the time, GPS receivers were extremely expensive. About $10,000. They were very bulky, a huge several pounds, maybe 10 pounds or so. They were deliberately degraded in terms of their accuracy by the government. So you might be lucky to get 300-foot accuracy. And they often had difficulty even obtaining the required satellites. But luckily, one of our volunteers donated his GPS receiver, Lloyd Buchanan. He offered it to Daniel to use, and through Daniel's painstaking work of working with this fairly primitive GPS receiver, he was able to GPS all of the trails in Harriman for our 1995 revision. So here's just a quick look at this GPS receiver. And just to give some sense of scale, there isn't really anything here. It's about an 8-inch by 8-inch square, and just nice and heavy. And you can imagine carrying that around on all the trails in Harriman. But it did the job. And so here's a quick example of what things look like pre-GPS versus after GPS. So as I mentioned, Daniel GPSed all of these trails, and the trail routes really significantly improved. Here's just a series of sections from Harriman from our 1989 map, where we can see things like this triangle trail that sort of crosses this stream a couple times. But if we go to the 1995 GPS tracks, the route of this triangle trail is completely different, and it only crosses this stream once here rather than way over here. And so Daniel was able to use that GPS plotting to see where things had been way off and where things could be improved. And if we compare it to our more recent maps, the 1995 map actually compares fairly well with the routes of the trails. So we've continued to refine our use of GPS technology to make the maps even more accurate, and we use that data in part for some of our trail mileage numbers that we put on the maps for the junction-to-junction trail mileage. So we're continuing to always refine that to make things more accurate. And so lastly, moving into the 2000s, in 2000, volunteer Herb Chong created our first digitally produced map, Sterling Forest, and our map standards have since been refined to sort of form the basis of our present day maps. And starting in 2012, our first app maps were offered on mobile devices through the Events Maps app. And right now we've got more than 70 maps available, with more than 200,000 maps downloaded through that app. So it continues to be a very popular option for people out on the trails. So here's our 2000 Sterling Forest map. This is our 2003 revision that made a few slight revisions. But this was our first digitally produced map, drawn entirely with computer software. This brought in over some of our standard elements from our previous maps, but also experimented with additional elements that were sort of possible now with computer mapping software. We also introduced UTM grid lines in addition to latitude, longitude lines. And these Sterling Forest maps weren't as well received as initially hoped, partly due to a sort of lack of interest, or not too many people knew about this sort of brand new state park in New York. But this first map was very helpful for figuring out how to develop these maps digitally to get to where we are today. And so here's a look at sort of our standard style now, as I showed before. This was our 2010 Catskill map, and this was a major undertaking in terms of volunteer field checking and cartography to update this map from the previous hand-drawn analog methods to a digital production. And this was our first map where we did introduce these junction-to-junction and trail mileage numbers. These have certainly proved to be very popular and something that we've tried to get on all of our other maps. We still have a few maps left that don't have them quite yet, but we're hoping to get them on future editions. And so lastly here, I'll get into this a little later on in the next section, but one of our last steps has been to sort of move our maps to the world of mobile devices, and the availability of our maps on iPhones and Android phones has really continued to be very popular. So it's great to see that. So that's a bit about the history of trail mapping in the region. And next I'll try to give some insight into this question that I get fairly often: how do you actually make the maps? Before we switch to that, though, I'll post one more of these quick polls just to get an idea of what your favorite trail conference map might be. And let me launch this up just to see where you might be, or what your what some of your favorite places to explore may be. And we're coming from all different areas right now, so it's neat to see what we've got here. So take a few moments, and I know if some of you have many favorite areas, it may be difficult to choose just one, but see what you can do. Try it out. Alrighty, let me see. Alrighty, so most of us are in here, so let me end this and share our results. So a bunch of Harriman Bear Mountain fans, that's great, and our Catskill East Hudson, and yeah, Kiddington, North Jersey, Shungum, a couple West Hudson, and some others. A few of you don't own any of them, that's fine. You should definitely check them out if you're exploring any of these areas. And if you haven't checked out our new Westchester map, which covers Teatown area, Ward Pound Ridge, and Rockefeller State Park Preserve. Once we start getting back out onto the trails, definitely check those out if you haven't before. All right, so cool. Thank you for letting me know what your favorite maps are. Always good to see that. So, how do we actually make the maps? All right, so this is the 6 easy steps of making a trail map. First, we need to decide what should be mapped. We obtain and organize the data for the map. We create a base map, label the features, conduct a review, and finally print the finished map. But like most anything, there's of course many different steps, not so easy steps sprinkled in between that. This was about all I could fit on the screen that wouldn't make it terribly hard for you to see. But with our, initially we need to do things like defining a coverage area and a map scale. We have to obtain the base map data from multiple sources, aerial photographs, different things like that. We organize the layers of the base map in different software, all the way down through where we attend the map printings to ensure print quality and receive the maps at our office, where volunteers then put them together and assemble them into map sets that make their way out to the public. So I'll go through some of these as I go through each section, starting with deciding what should be mapped. So when we have a new project, we sort of develop the scope of it. Is it a new map? Is it a revision to an existing map? A few different options that we've got. And we try to secure a project manager, and we work with our volunteer publications committee to work through different decisions and figure out how to proceed with the maps. We also do things like define the map coverage area, the scale, the number of the maps in the set, what their sizes might be, and how they're going to fold. And for this, we work with different map layouts and often go through multiple iterations to figure out the best way to get the maps together. We also decide what features should be shown, whether any features in particular should be highlighted, and also determine if we might need inset maps for things like really complex areas or busy areas that might need an inset for people to use. So here's an example of how we use these map layouts, to plan out how our maps are going to fit. So this is our 2010 Catskill map, which includes 6 maps, as well as here a cover and a small insert. And what we do is we basically work with these full sheets of Tyvek that are about 2 feet by 3 feet long. And that's the space that we have available on which to fit our maps and lay out the materials that we'll need for creating the maps. So here with these, we use 2 sheets of Tyvek for this map, per map. And we pretty much used all the space available except for one little square on the top there. And sort of maximize the available area to make the maps as big as possible and at as large a scale as we can within the constraints of what we have there. So our next steps, once we've made those initial decisions, are to obtain and organize the data. So we get most of our base map data from a variety of different entities, from the federal level down to state, local, nonprofits. And this includes things like park boundaries, lakes and streams, transportation-related things. We produce the contour lines for the maps in ArcGIS software. And these also come from a few different sources, but we also sort of use primarily a data set from USGS, where we're able to create different contour line intervals where we have 20 foot, 50 foot, 10 foot. For some of our trail planning work, we might use 1 foot, 2 foot sort of intervals for scouting out some different trails and things like that. One of the big things that we do can take a lot of effort is coordinating the collection of much of the GPS track and waypoint data that's done by volunteers out on the trails. As one example of this, are over 150 trips were taken by volunteers GPSing trails in the Catskills for our 2010 Catskill map. If you can imagine, these were mostly at least half day, if not full day trips. That's quite a lot of time that the volunteers spent collecting that data. And lastly, once we have this information, this data, we edit and organize all of it in ArcGIS software. So here's an example of one of the planning tools we use for doing this sort of coordination of collecting GPS data. For something like the Catskills, where we have such a large area, we used a planning map like this to identify areas where we had currently had good data. So on this map, all of these different red lines are trails that we had good data that we were confident in. And some of these different blue lines, such as out here in the Western Catskills and different areas, these correlated with areas where we had either no data or data that we weren't really confident in. And so we wanted to direct some volunteers collecting data to get out to those areas. So creating sort of planning maps like this allowed us to get out to all the trails without sort of duplicating efforts and that sort of thing. So when volunteers are out collecting this data, just to give an idea of what that really means, here's a few shots from a field collection data that I had done near Blackhead Mountain in the Catskills a few years back. So this is just a screenshot from Google Earth that shows the GPS track in red that I had collected, as well as a number of waypoints that indicated different things, such as viewpoints, trail intersections, or different springs or water sources. And collecting that data in the field allowed us to sort of make the maps when I got back to the office. Just a quick aside, if you're not familiar with Google Earth or similar applications, it's a pretty neat way to be able to visualize the trail information, and this is just an example of, on the bottom here, how the data I collected on Google Earth overlaid with the topography. And here you can see Blackhead and Black Dome and the Blackhead Range. It looks pretty comparable to the actual photograph taken from this viewpoint here. So if you haven't played around with Google Earth or similar software, it's a pretty neat way to check things out if you might collect data on your GPS data on your phone or other device. So anyway, the data that we collected, one of the first things we did was we compared it with the existing maps that we had. So in the background here is our old hand-drawn Catskill map. And we can see that the new data I collected, which here is this darker, the black line here, In general, the old map captured the trail routes fairly well. Some of the slighter wiggles of the trails, or even a newer switchback, hadn't been really on the old maps. But at least we saw that in general the old routes matched up fairly well. But we could see is some things such as these. There's a viewpoint star down here on the northern side of Blackhead that was a little bit off from where it actually was, and similarly here a stream source that was a pipe coming out near the trail that was off a little bit from where it actually was on the map. But in the end, we're able to take that data and work that into the actual map. So we can see here the trail route itself. Here are these few switchbacks that I captured, correct locations of the spring and viewpoint. And so that GPS collected data, we're able to sort of work right into the maps and get them updated that way. So as I mentioned, we take all of this data and we use software called ArcMap, ArcGIS, to edit and organize all of the data. And so this isn't where the actual maps themselves are created, but we're able to organize the data. Here are different layers where we've got our trails, our roads, our county lines, our parklands, and we use sort of rough approximated colors to at least give an idea of what the different data layers are like. So once we've got that, our next step is to create the base map. So for this, we use data from ArcGIS, and we construct the base map in Adobe Illustrator software. For this, to do this, we use a plugin for Adobe that's called Map Publisher, and what this allows us to do is maintain the link with the coordinate system and pretty much use GIS data, spatial data directly within Illustrator, where we have a greater control on design and that sort of thing. Now we follow style standards that have been developed over time by the Publications Committee, and you saw sort of the progression of that with that map history. But we have specific line styles, line widths, colors, different things like that we use for each of the different kinds of data. And lastly, we try to finish the base map before any of the actual labeling begins. So that way we've got everything down on the map and can then work in the labels. So here's a screenshot of a map in progress in Adobe Illustrator. And just for a frame of reference, right here in the middle is our Hunter Mountain area of the Catskills, and the Devil's Path going across here. So here again, similar to in ArcGIS, we can work with all of our different data layers individually, our roads, our trails, our water sources. But here's where we can introduce those specific line styles and colors, line widths, and everything else that is added onto the map. So once we've got our base map done, we start on our labeling, and this also follows style standards developed over time. So everything from fonts to font sizes, colors, unique symbols we've created. For this, the contour line labeling can be pretty time intensive. But once all of the labels are completed, we produce a draft that's ready for review. And as work has progressed on the map, the front of the map, I should say, we've also been working on material for the back of the map with editing and revisions by volunteers and a graphic designer that lays that information out and makes it easy to read and look nice for everyone to have on the backs of the maps. So as one example of our labeling, the 2010 edition of Catskill Maps, which was our largest map set, both in terms of coverage area and number of maps, contains 5,700 text labels and symbols that were all manually placed on the maps. So a large portion of this, almost 1,500, were little contour labels that were all individually put on and rotated just right so they would fit on there. Or more than 700 road name labels and symbols, 400 trailblaze symbols, all the way down to one hospital. If there's a hospital on or near the map, it's always a good idea to highlight that, just in case the need arises for that. So here's a screenshot of that same area of Hunter Mountain in the Catskills, just showing all the different labels. And this allows us to see how we've got different kinds of text and colors and font styles for different features. So we see all of these brown contour labels are blue water features. Most any of the red are things related to the trails, so including the blaze colors, the mileage numbers, the trail names. And so when you sort of take away the base map layer, you're able to see how all these different symbols and text components come together. And if we add in the base map, we've got our completed map of base map, labeling, and we're ready for that review stage. So this is one of the more important parts of the process, where we provide the draft maps to knowledgeable individuals, primarily within the Trail Conference organization for some initial review. And this often includes many of our on-the-ground trail maintainers, supervisors, trail crews that are out on these trails and know them very intimately to be able to know whether something might be wrong with the map or not. After we do an initial revision, we do a second round of external review to include parks and landowners to allow them to make note of things that they might want to highlight, or if they have upcoming projects that we weren't aware of, we're able to work those into the maps. And finally, we finalize the maps based on these final reviews, and throughout the process try to make note of any of the review comments, significant changes that were made, and reasons for making or possibly for not making any certain changes, so that we have that for future use. But once we've done that review, we're ready for the last stage of printing the map. So not all printers have experience printing on this Tyvek material. This Tyvek, we actually have to special order for the maps. We do attend the map printing to ensure print quality, especially to make sure the reds of the trails are red enough and the browns of the contours are not too faint but not too dark. We've been working with the same printer up in Albany for, I think we're at least 30 years now, but it might be even longer. They're sort of a reliable source for the printing on this Tyvek for our maps. Once they're done printing the maps and cutting them up and folding them, we receive the maps back at the office, and volunteers begin assembling the maps for sale in the plastic baggies that they come in. And again, all of our map files and review comments and everything are archived for reference for the next edition, in case something comes up there where we need to reference what we did with the previous edition. So here's a couple shots of one of our map printings. This shows one of the big printers up in Albany, where we get our maps printed, where each of the different inks is laid out here in a different inkwell. This is our one volunteer, Daniel Chazen, who's very active with all of our maps. And on the bottom right here is one of the folding machines where the cut maps go through a series of different folding things and folds it down into that nice compact size. It's pretty neat to watch and visit the printers when they're doing all that. So with that, we get our finished maps, and one of the things we try to do is highlight how it isn't just the cartographer behind the computer that makes the map, but there are so many volunteers and partner organizations that assist with these projects. So for our 2010 new Catskill Trails map, this was one of the things that we had put together. Is we had a map launch party, I believe, where most all of the individuals listed here were people who helped field check, collect GPS data, review the maps, or otherwise help with the maps that way. And along the bottom here, you can see a number of the different partner organizations we worked with, both in terms of state agencies, nonprofits, and many different organizations. So this was our specific for our Catskill map, but pretty much every map is similar to this in terms of working with local groups and state agencies and everyone to make sure we get the accurate, important information on the maps. So moving to the Avenza maps, just as we wrap this up here, more than 70 maps, as I mentioned, are available through the Avenza Maps app. More than 200,000 maps have been downloaded so far. Currently, we're one of the top-selling map vendors, and if you haven't checked out the app before, you definitely should once you get back out onto the trails. You can pinpoint your location on the map, mark waypoints, measure distances, do lots of different things using our map as the base map. And here are just a few examples of how you can see your little blue dot for where you're located on the map. This is not where I actually am right now. It'd be nice to be out on the trails, but I'm at home working on this webinar. You can also, here in the middle, you can collect tracks and statistics about your hikes. And here on the right is just some examples of how you can take waypoints, attach pictures to those. Many of our volunteers use this for noting blowdowns, or our invasive surveyors use it for identifying areas where invasive species are located. So there's lots of different things you can do with the app. And again, if you haven't checked that out before, definitely check it out with a bunch of our different maps. Here's me just up at High Point State Park, where I'm using it out on the trail, and I've got my little blue dot where I'm at the viewing platform looking over at High Point Monument. So that's Avenza Maps, and one last thing with Avenza Maps that we've been exploring is because we're sort of in the digital realm, we're not restricted to the sort of Tyvek or the size of the Tyvek, or how big we can print something on our printer in the office. So we've been able to put together things such as this combined Catskill map, which took our 6 existing Catskill maps and stitched them together, and even expanded to a greater Catskills area to allow use throughout the Catskills just with a single Avenza Map app. And also similarly, we've done it in other areas such as our Kittatinny Trails map set, where we're able to stitch the 4 maps together and have a continuous map all the way from the Delaware Water Gap up to the New York state line. So we're continuing to explore ways we can use these app maps that sort of take us beyond what we were limited to with traditional printing. Of course, with one thing we do try to stress is that these digital maps are not necessarily meant to be a replacement for paper maps. Plenty of things can go wrong and have gone wrong from lots of stories we've heard. So we still try to tell people, carry along a printed map as backup, if that means one of our sort of printed on Tyvek, waterproof, tear-resistant maps, or even just some park handout map or whatever might be available. That's always great to bring along, so you're not just relying on that digital device that could go haywire at any moment. So wrapping up here, I just wanted to put a few map statistics on here and explain what these mean. So 850,000 maps, that's the approximate number of maps that we've printed since the early 1970s that have gotten out to the public using these trails. 470 miles is, if placed end to end, all of these different printed maps would stretch nearly 470 miles. Just to give some sense, that basically covers the Appalachian Trail from, I think it's Pennsylvania, all the way through New Hampshire. So that's a good amount of maps. 48 years, as I mentioned before, that's the length of time that official Trail Conference maps have been produced. And if we incorporate the unofficial maps produced by William Hefferlin, that extends to 86 years that maps have been produced by the Trail Conference. I've mentioned a couple times we've surpassed 200,000 app map downloads, and we've also had about 118 map printings since the early 1970s. I've been lucky enough to oversee, I think at this point, more than 40 of these map printings, and it's always fun seeing seeing the maps in huge printers up in Albany as they go through those. So I've mentioned several different times how volunteers are really important through this process. They're at all steps, from our initial plotting of what we're going to do to managing the projects, collecting the data, doing the review, assembling the maps when they're completed. So our publications committee is always looking for volunteers to help with our maps and books, writers, editors, proofreaders, field checkers, graphic designers. We would always love marketing help to help get our maps out to even more people. So if you might have any interest in these opportunities, don't hesitate to contact us. The event confirmation email you got from us, you can respond back to that and reach out to our volunteer managers to get more information with that. So that's how we make trail maps. Thanks again for tuning in today, and I'm going to go into chat to sort of see if I can answer some questions. If you'd like to ask a question, use that chat window and I'll take a look. And first, I'm going to post one last quick poll to get your rating for how you liked this webinar, and if you have any other feedback, you can definitely reply back to that email and let people or let our volunteer managers know what you thought of the webinar. If you have any thoughts or feedback, it's always appreciated. And with that, I'll start looking back through the chat to see what questions we've got here. Alrighty. All right, so as this is wrapping up here, one question that someone had asked, Adrian, are you recording this and sending a link for us to refer back to? I believe we are recording these webinars. I'm not certain when or how they might be shared, but yes, we do hope to be able to provide this for reference, or for people who weren't able to get to see attend the webinar, either because it filled up with many of you joining, or if people were just unable to with the time of day or other obligations. So we'll see what we can do with that. Lots of great comments about using Avenza and its features. We need a webinar just for those. We might consider that as well. So stay tuned as we try to figure out some other instructional sort of things we can do. There's lots you can do with Venza maps, either for recreational use or for doing trail work or other things on the trails. So we'll see if we can pull something together to help people figure out how to use that more for what they want to do. All right, there was a question about a webinar on how to read trail maps. Some people may be unable to attend a traditional sort of how to read trail maps class that are offered by some of our retail partners or other things like that. And yeah, webinar might be ideal for that in terms of providing that instruction. So we'll see if that's something that we can do. Yeah, certainly stay tuned as we try to figure out some additional ways we can reach out to you during this time. So we'll see there. And yeah, a couple comments about also carrying a compass, and Avenza is great, but carry your paper maps. So yeah, definitely we're trying to keep that on the minds of people as they use the Avenza Maps app. All right, so yeah, a couple of great interests in the Avenza webinar. We'll see what we can do there. All right, what do cartographers major in? What skills are generally required for this line of work? Basically, I have a pretty broad background in environmental science from undergraduate and graduate degrees. where I did things such as mapping out geologic features or glacial features, soil mapping, lots of different things as part of a broad environmental science background. So that's sort of the ability to use some different skills with different environmental things is what got me to where I am. And just having an eye for design and being able to bring in data and make it look good on a map and make sense are things that sort of take time to develop. But that's sort of what's sort of required for cartography. One question here: is there a plan to include the Avenza full coverage maps for different groupings like the Catskills? So yeah, currently we have our Catskill map was the first that we produced a sort of combined map, and we've expanded that to our Harriman maps and North Jersey maps, I believe at the moment, and Kittatinny, yes. So yeah, each time we do a map revision, we look at if we can work that in and do some broader groupings where we bring in some of the different maps and have the individual maps available, but also have the combined map so you can see everything on one individual map. All right, here's a great question that we get sometimes. All right, hikers use different GPS units, whether it's their Garmin device, an iPhone, Fitbit. What accounts for the differences in total mileage and elevation gain measured by these units on the same hike? So yeah, this happens quite often where even myself, I might have a Garmin GPS unit that's tracking a hike and an app on my iPhone, and they're both on for the same time period and same hike, and when I finish, one has me at a half mile longer than the other. And what it sort of comes down to are a few different factors that all combine to create some varied results. That can be things such as different weather conditions that can affect the GPS receiver, the unit in your particular device, or how the app itself collects the data. There may be apps that use different recording intervals, so they might be getting less data points than other apps or units. And even things such as if you're sitting for lunch at a certain area, one app may actually capture small movements that can add up to a tenth or quarter of a mile, whereas the other app may not capture that information. And so there's lots of different ways that you can get those to add up or affect the mileage and similarly elevation gain. So yeah, that can vary, but at least it provides an approximation for that sort of information. All right, one specific question about on a Harriman map, I saw an unmarked trail that goes through a keep out area. Is this open for hiking? So in general, if there's one of the red sort of crossed keep out symbols, generally means an area that is not open to the public, and if it's specifically on an unmarked trail, that generally means that particular trail should not be followed into the private areas. In some instances, we may choose to continue showing those unmarked trails and add a keep out symbol because they can be important for search and rescue purposes or some other frame of reference. In other instances where it might make more sense to just not show the trail, we may have a keep out symbol and just show the trail ending an unmarked trail. So yeah, that's generally how it goes, but it can vary from one instance to the next. All right, another question here. Always fascinated to look at the mapped woods roads. Do you guys map those with GPS, or are those trails and roads that were mapped years and years ago and just overlaid on the updated maps? Much of that has been GPSed by volunteers going out in the field. We also more recently have utilized various aerial photography, aerial imagery data sources where especially some of the more obvious or broader woods roads can be fairly easy to see in the high-resolution aerial imagery, so we can trace that out and add that onto the maps, and often verify with on-the-ground visits to make sure that what we have mapped out actually exists. So yeah, most of that has come from going out in the field and actually checking them out. Question about the project lead time. What is the project lead time? So we're generally working with several of our published on Chivec maps are on a regular sort of 2 to 3 year revision cycle that we're constantly working on those sorts of maps. But when an idea for a new map comes up, it's usually something that takes a while to develop. It might be a year or two to plan out what we want to do and actually collect the data, and then to produce the maps. Yeah, anywhere from a 2 to 3 or 4 year period of time from when we sort of initially think of an idea for a map to when it's available to the public. That can change if there's something that's more pressing or something that's just come up, and we might make a map more quickly than that. But for some of our larger projects, that's around what we do with that. One question about who comes up with the nicknames for places on the map. The Irish potato or poached egg is one in Harriman that gets a few question marks. These are things that, yeah, these sort of informal or in some cases they were unofficial but have become official place names, are mostly things that have been carried down from previous sources or previous maps. Looking through some of these old Bill Heffernan Hikers Regional maps, a lot of those are on there even then. So there often isn't too many times where we sort of introduce new names that haven't been existing already, or if a park owner, park manager has names for places, we'll likely include those because they come from sort of the official source as the park. But yeah, if you're ever poring over the maps and wondering, I wonder where that came from, there are plenty of those on the maps. All right, so another question similar to the lead time: how is it determined that a map needs to be reprinted or updated? So we generally try to use a sort of 2 to 3 year revision cycle, sometimes extending up to 4 years for certain maps, where we've sort of found the sweet spot of enough trail changes have been done that, or enough things have changed on the ground that it warrants making a map, and it hasn't gone too long since the last revision. So most of our maps, if they're 4 or 5 years old, are sort of enough things have become outdated that we want to make sure they're updated. And maps such as our Harriman map, we reprint that fairly frequently with revisions, because a lot of little things change, even if it doesn't seem so when you're just visiting at certain times. So so yeah, that's pretty much what determines our map revision cycle. So yeah, another question about how does one become a cartographer, and again, it's that came from experience with lots of different mapping and environmental science applications, and I had some initial ArcGIS training that allowed me to get into some of the mapping a little bit more. So yeah, for a college student working on how to think about that possibility, just having those different ArcGIS experiences and sort of broad experience with environmental science is how I sort of got to where I am. All right, question related to the Avenza maps. When maps are revised, do we need to buy them again on Avenza, or are they supposed to update automatically? So maps that you purchase through the map store on Avenza are once you buy one of them, you have that particular edition for however long you have the device or have that account. When we produce a new edition, oops, sorry. When we produce a new edition of the map, similarly to the print maps, that's available as a sort of separate map that you have to purchase again. One thing that we have been working with Avenza Maps, the app, to implement, and the most recent maps have had this, is if you have the previous map, you're now able to get a notification that a new map is available, and if you purchase that, you're able to get that at a discount. I believe right now it's generally around 25 to 35% off, I believe is what we're at right now. But that allows you to sort of see that a new map is available. Here are the things that have been updated with the map. And if you choose to get that updated one, you can get it at a discount versus the full price. So we're continuing to work with the developer Avenza to see ways that we can improve on that and do things such as, if you purchase our print map, you can also get the digital map at a discount. We haven't quite been able to figure that out yet, but we're always looking for ways we can do that. All right, so let's see. Real quick suggestion for another webinar about map reading, virtual orienteering. So yeah, we might be able to do some additional things like that. If we can work on that, we'll see what we can do there. All right, was Bill Hefferlin a cartographer? He really was not. So he was, I think he turned into a great cartographer. He wasn't a cartographer by training. He did have experience around the time that he started the Hikers Regions maps in the 30s. He had been working at one of the sort of map stores that was in New York City at the time. I forget where exactly or what it was. So he was very familiar with maps, and he certainly had the ability to draw, and he had many illustrations and different things. So certainly not by formal training, but he turned into a great cartographer, and yeah, for nearly 40 years of maps that he produced. It's very evident from looking through those. All right, so question here, can you recommend some open source mapping tools? Unfortunately, I don't have too much experience with open source mapping. I've dabbled a little bit with things such as QGIS for some GIS mapping, and different things like that, and just using simple Google Earth to create maps. But beyond that, I'm not too familiar, as I mostly work within this ArcGIS and the Adobe Illustrator for the mapping, the data organization, and the map creation itself. Real quick back up here, I'm a trail maintainer, but the webinars are full. Any way of sneaking in? We're hoping, we're just wanted to note that this is sort of the first week that we're trying out these webinars for instructional things, and right now we're working through different limits of how many people we can have on, and certain sessions are work well for larger groups. This worked pretty well here. Others are limited with how many people can attend, but yeah, as we move forward, we're going to try and figure out ways that if people want to be able to check out these webinars and have the availability and time to do so, we'll try to make sure that they can get on rather than getting this event is full notice. We definitely want to avoid that if we can, so stay tuned with that. All right, real quick, yeah, so someone chimed in that QGIS is a great free tool to start with. Need to learn about data sources for your area, and yeah, right now there's so many different data sources for trail information and different things from county levels, state levels. So if you're looking to do that sort of mapping things, there are lots of resources out there. You just have to try and find them. Alrighty, real quick, here's a question about trail mileage. So if a trail goes 1 mile linear, but up 500 feet and down 500 feet, how far does the map distance show? So to produce our trail mileage numbers, we use a combination of different data sources. One of those, if it's available, are wheeled mileages, where someone has gone out with a measurement wheel and walked the trails to create pretty accurate wheeled mileage distances. And so we have those for places like Harriman and even much of the Catskills. through some efforts of volunteers on the ground there. So we use that if available, but we don't have that for most areas. So what we do use are sort of GIS trail routes that appear on the maps. We're able to use those in the GIS software and combine them with some elevation modeling to pretty much create what the effects of some of these elevation sort of things, if you go up 500 feet, down 500 feet, that can add a bit, that can, over the course of a longer trail, can certainly add up to something significant. So we use a bunch of different things to create those trail mileage numbers. And to the specific question, the map distance, or the distance, doesn't increase that greatly from 1 mile for a sort of 500 feet up and down. But over the course of many 500-foot up and down hills, it can definitely create a longer distance. So yeah, a great note from someone. They have some of the old Walking News maps, and yeah, they're really neat. If you ever get a chance to see these Walking News, the Hikers Region maps, there are some copies that are available at sort of local libraries, or you can even search online for some of them. They're pretty neat to check over. At the Trail Conference, we have a pretty extensive, comprehensive archive from donated maps and different maps that have been collected through the years. So we've got a great collection of the maps that in my spare time, it's neat to check through them for sure. All right, just working through the last few of these questions here. All right, one thing here related to Avenza Maps. I've been using Map My Walk app. It maps my hike and tells me the mileage in real time as I hike, and I can save the hike afterwards. Does Avenza Maps do this? And yes, one of the features that is available is you can track your hike, track your walk, and as you're doing that, you can see how far you've gone, how long you've been going, your elevation statistics of how much you've traveled elevation wise. Yeah, and you can stop recording that at the end of your walk and save that for a future reference, or you can share it with people. So yeah, that is available through Avenza Maps, and that allows you to sort of use our map background as the base map on which you can collect that data and that sort of real-time mileage and hike information. So yeah, definitely check that out if you are able to. All right, and with that, yeah, will these webinars be posted somewhere on the website? If we are able to make these available, you'll likely get some notification through our volunteer communications, or make it available on our website in some way. We're not certain quite yet what we'll be able to do there, but we'll see what we can do. So with that, thank you all for joining in. Definitely keep checking out our events page or our communications for any additional webinars we might have as we try to work through this time. And we're all excited to get back out on the trail, so hopefully this helps fill some of our time a bit. Thank you again, and hope to see you soon. Take care.